everybody. Welcome back to English 247. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 10th of June. And believe it or not, we are headed towards the midpoint of the semester. As you know, the summer session is highly condensed, which would mean that paper number one would be due ideally on the 12th of June, which is this upcoming Thursday, which puts us midway through. And I ask that you submit in that paper via PDF, because that's how my grading program works best, to my email address. Again, that's how my grading program works best, at ruiz, R-U-I-Z, at gcc.mass.edu. Now, as I had indicated previously, I have rolling due dates, so you don't necessarily have to have in that paper by the 12th, and you're certainly encouraged to submit in that paper prior to the 12th. But do understand that after the 12th, there isn't a whole lot left to the semester. So you will definitely want to keep me apprised if you haven't submitted in your paper by the 12th, because you want to have enough time so that you have the option of revising that paper if you so want to. I think of that first paper as a learning exercise. So I will put comments on it, and based on the grade and my comments, you might elect to do a revision, which would be due by the ending of the semester. I just ask that you submit in the original evaluated copy by me, along with your revision that incorporates my suggestions, so that I can compare and contrast the two. And you would have the higher of the two grades. However, as you know, the idea behind the second paper, since it's due at the ending of the semester, is that you would have used the first paper as a learning exercise, so that when you submit in the second paper, which is due at the ending of the semester, that you wouldn't need to do a revision, and obviously you wouldn't have time to do a revision if you hand in that second paper at the ending of the semester. There is a possibility, however, if you were to submit in the second paper early enough, that you could do a revision of that. But it would be something that we would have to negotiate. The first paper is something that everybody has the option of revising. And if you'll remember, in our syllabus, I had indicated just some general suggestions, more than suggestions, some general instructions about formatting, that it should be typed and double spaced with a 1-inch margin. Again, you can find this on our syllabus, and hopefully this is review from previous English classes, that you are numbering your pages and you are including a separate title page, which lists the title of your paper and some identifying information: your name, my name, the due date, the paper number, of course, paper title. So that's it. I am looking forward to seeing what your first paper is about. And as you know, you have the option of writing on either the story of an hour, though that requires some very detailed analysis because it is a short story, or Frankenstein, or lastly, Persuasion, which is what we are putting some closure on. Jane Eyre is a possibility, but we're not really going to be discussing Jane Eyre until the next class, so you're probably better off waiting for paper number 2 if you wanted to write about Jane Eyre. And paper number 1 and paper number 2 are very similar, the difference being that paper number 1 is dealing with the earlier text, or one of the earlier texts in the semester. Paper number 2 is dealing with one of the later texts in the semester. And last class, I had suggested that you might want to think about persuasion in terms of characters. And I had divided up the characters based on gender, but there are lots of different ways you could divide up the characters. However, another way that you could think about this text is thinking about it as volume 1 and volume 2, which is how the author divides up our stories. And the text, as I had said last class, is basically as a satire and a gentle critique on inherited wealth, but we also get a romance story, which means that we will get our happily ever after. And we see how important decorum and appearances are in the 1800s, particularly for the upper classes. And this is one of the reasons why the Bartonage is mentioned so early on in the text. Baron is the lowest order of British nobility that would be included in the Bartonage, and Sir Walter Elliot, while he's not a baron, he does have status, which means that he could be included in the Bartonage. And the reference always to Sir Walter's obsession with appearance and needing mirrors to be able to see his physical appearance. And what this text really is a reflection, and not a very flattering one, of the wealthy and the privileged. Lady Elliot is widowed, or I should say that Sir Elliot is widowed because Lady Elliot has passed away. And an interesting quote at the beginning of book one is that she had humored or softened or concealed Sir Walter's failings. And though she was not the very happiest being in the world herself, she had found enough in her duties, her friends, and her children to attach to life. And I can't help but think of the Cult of True Womanhood, because this is very much a description of what the ideal female would be, that she would be supportive to her husband and to her children, and that her needs would be secondary to her family. We're told that it's been 13 years that Lady Elliot has been gone, and 13 is an ominous number, so this sets the tone of the piece as being somewhat negative. And we find out that Sir Walter, even though he has status, he is in financial difficulties. And what has happened is that his three daughters have basically taken on different roles in the household, with Elizabeth, the oldest, being the lady of the house, basically replacing Lady Elliot. So even though Elizabeth is the oldest, and 29 would be an ominous age for a woman to still be unmarried, even today, the idea of a female turning 30 is rather significant, but especially during this time period. But Sir Walter isn't worried about Elizabeth. He's sure that she'll marry at one point or another, and he certainly is benefiting from the idea that Elizabeth is single, because she can take on the caretaking role for him that her mother had had previously. The middle daughter, Anne, who is our narrator, is 27, and this is of concern because she is still unmarried and she's, quote, lost her bloom, unquote. Again, the importance of appearance, especially for female, and one might say that still exists in today's world. And to add insult to injury, perhaps, it's the youngest daughter, Mary, who is married, and merely to a respectable family, merely, quote unquote. A family with fortune, but not nobility. And of course, both are important from Sir Walter's perspective. Sir Walter, in continual fear of a middle class being able to overtake the noble class, and the Navy in particular, quote, bringing persons of obscure birth into undue distinction, unquote. So the way that the family decides to save face is by vacationing in Bath, which was considered to be a very popular tourist place, in order for their estate to be rented out so that they could generate some income. Anne, at this point, isn't really wanted by the family. She's usually considered to be an outcast and an outsider. So she stays with her sister Mary, and as self-centered as Mary happens to be, and as much of a hypochondriac as Mary tends to be, she also is probably more loving towards Anne than any of the other family members, or at least more tolerant of Anne than any of the other family members. So this first book is going to focus on Anne basically staying with her sister and her brother-in-law, who, remember, had once proposed to Anne. Years ago, she turned him down, and Mary, Anne's sister, ended up marrying him, which leads to a little bit of romantic tension there. And the family that Mary had married into, the Musgroves, is a very different kind of family than the Elliot family. They have hobbies, they have interests, and they allow their daughters to court and marry on their own, which would be considered to be highly progressive for this time period and is in direct contrast to the Elliot family. As the Musgrove family begins to rely more and more on Anne, Anne begins to recapture her quote bloom unquote because she has self-esteem and she has purpose in a way that she didn't have with her family of origin. And of course, since all of the characters have some connection to one another, the Musgrove family is also connected to Frederick Wentworth, who happens to be the brother of Mrs. Croft, who is renting out Kellynch Hall, which is the Elliot family residence. But the Musgroves are connected to Frederick Wentworth, a man who went and found his worth through the Navy. So he doesn't necessarily have status, but he does definitely have money when he returns after his naval stint. Through their dead naval son Richard, who's continually referred to as poor Richard. Basically, he's a wayward youth, and Frederick Wentworth did his best to protect him and also to care for him. Now, one of the episodes that is considered to be major, though most of us might consider it to be minor, is when little Charlie Musgrove, and note the similarities of the names. There's lots of Charleses, there's lots of Williams. These would be considered appropriate names for a particular rank and status in society. We still see that, for instance, with the royal family in England. Little Charles Musgrove falls and dislocates his collarbone, which reinforces this idea of falling. We see this with characters falling in love, as well as with Louisa, who falls off of the wall later. Neither parent wants to really stay and care for him because they would really spend or prefer to spend their time with the new visitor, Frederick Wentworth, who again is eliciting quite a bit of excitement because this is somebody from outside of their community who has status in the military, who has wealth, and is also single. So he would be a good match, so to speak. And Anne is the one who stays as they visit Frederick Wentworth, with Mary uttering some really interesting commentary that it's assumed that she needs to stay at home and take care of her child because she's the mother, and she finds it to be quite unfair that the father is able to go off and meet this new interesting person, Frederick Wentworth, but she is expected to stay home. Of course, we know that Mary is very self-centered, and she ends up leaving as well, and leaving the caretaking duties to Anne, who's relieved to do so because she's not quite ready to meet Frederick Wentworth, a former ex, if you will, and she understands how awkward their meeting will be. She turned him down, of course, because she was persuaded, hence the title, to do so. And the idea behind this novel is to persuade us about some of the false facades associated with nobility and with the upper classes. Now, a couple that's considered to be progressive in this time period is the Admiral and Mrs. Croft, who rent out Kellynch Hall. And again, Sir Walter is willing to rent out to an admiral because there's a certain status there, but it certainly wouldn't overshadow Sir Walter's status. They have no children. And they married, not because they were a good match, but they married for love. And they talk about that the worst thing that can happen in marriage is a separation. Even in today's day, it can raise eyebrows when you have a couple who's decided by choice not to have children. So the major excitement is visiting Frederick Wentworth and visiting Frederick Wentworth's friends, the Harvilles, who happen to be in a neighboring town, Lyme. And the Harvilles are also similar to the Musgroves. They have their hobbies, and they're more concerned with basically their own affairs than gossiping and watching others. And for Anne, this is an epiphany that there's another way to live life. Of course, we know that book one ends with that what is supposed to be very dramatic fall when Louisa falls off the wall because of her impulsivity, which goes to illustrate that you want to avoid the extremes of too much independence, which is what Louisa has, but also You want to avoid the extreme of being too submissive, which is what Anne was when she allowed herself to be persuaded um, to not marry her love, Frederick Wentworth. And she recuperates at the Harvilles. It just so happens that because she is in close proximity to a bachelor at the Harvilles who's staying with them because his fiancee has died, that they're going to end up having a relationship. This entire novel is about relationships. In many ways, it's much like a soap opera. It's only in volume 2 that we return back to Sir Walter's story. And this is where we find out about Mr. William Elliot, the heir presumptive. He's the closest male heir to the family, again, Sir Walter Elliot having only females. And he returns to the Elliot family circle. We find out about this long, convoluted story that it had seemed that he was interested in being part of the family and marrying within the family, probably Elizabeth, the oldest daughter. But then he disappeared, and then he ended up marrying somebody else, somebody who was considered to be inferior but who had wealth. And she's passed away, which would be an appropriate way to end a marriage at this point. And Sir Elliot has returned, or I should say, Mr. Elliot has returned to Sir Elliot and his family. And now that he has money, the one thing that he doesn't have is status, which is something that Sir Walter can provide. So Sir Elliot comes back and realizes that Anne is still single and is much more worthy than her older sister, who happens to be rather cold and self centered and, again, very concerned with superficialities. In many ways, she's similar to her father, Sir Walter Elliot. We find out that Anne, because she's of such a superior intellect and also of just a superior morality in the sense that she values honesty and integrity above appearances, that the major single men in this book are all interested in Anne. Captain Benwick, who is staying with the Harvilles because he has lost his fiancée, who's died because they had a long engagement. Mr. Elliot, who of course is trying to reintegrate himself back into the fold of the Elliot family and be able to have the status of the Elliot family, and Frederick Wentworth, who's never quite gotten over Anne. And we learn that Viscountess Dalrymple is superior in status to Sir Walter. She is a distant family relation. And we see how Sir Walter acts not just to people who are beneath him in terms of status, but the way he acts towards people above him in terms of status. And both he and Mr. Elliot both try to impress the Viscountess. And Anne talks about how she was, quote, ashamed, unquote, of her family, and that she'd prefer the company of clever, well-informed people who had a great deal of conversation rather than spend her time worrying about birth, education, and manners, which was the primary concern of this social status of the Elliot family and others like them. And Anne shows this by being friends with a Mrs. Smith, Smith being a poor, infirm, hopeless widow, quote unquote, living in Westgate Buildings. And the idea is Smith is a common name, and what is a Smith? It's something that Elliot talks about. And the idea that she is a widow, but she doesn't get the advantages of being a widow because ultimately she doesn't have money, nor does she have anybody to act in her behalf, which means she has no powerful male figures in her immediate vicinity to help her. Now, Anne, despite being incredibly progressive, is also human and experiences temptation and thinks about marrying William Elliot, and that would mean that she would become Lady Elliot of Kilnage Hall. Again, not that uncommon for cousins to marry within bloodlines in order to be able to keep status and rank within the family, as well as finances. Not that Elliot is aware that the family has hit upon hard financial times. However, she resists because she understands that William Eliot was, quote, rational, discreet, polished, but not open, unquote, which goes again to show Anne's superiority of character. Captain Benwick, who's spending some time with Louisa, who had fallen off of the wall, end up falling in love, and they are very much opposites. He is very introverted and very bookish. Louisa is very extroverted, and again, the whole message behind the novel is to avoid the extremes. So it seems that through their union, they'll both meet in the middle. So Louisa will become a little bit more quiet and bookish, and Benwick will become a little bit more outgoing and adventurous. Wentworth talks about how he's so surprised that Benwick is so easily able to get over his dead fiancée, that a man does not recover from such a devotion of the heart to such a woman. He ought not. He does not. In other words, projecting for himself that he still has feelings for Anne despite the fact that she rejected his marriage proposal. Mrs. Smith, it turns out, was friends with Mr. Eliot, Mr. William Eliot. Again, everybody is connected. And he is responsible for bringing her deceased husband to financial ruin. And he refuses to help her secure her small inheritance of property. So we find out just what a cad, what a horrible individual Mr. Eliot is. And all of this is evidenced through letters which she shares with Anne. This reminds me a little bit of Frankenstein when we were talking about the epistolary novel and how oftentimes information was given through letters. But here's the evidence for Anne. And this just reinforces Anne's decision that she shouldn't, regardless of the temptation, marry William Eliot. And of Henrietta and Charles Hayter, they're dating on and off throughout the novel. He is going to go into the ministry, which is considered a noble profession, even though he wouldn't be earning any significant amount of money. And again, the parents don't interfere with their daughter's decisions on whom to marry, which would be considered rather progressive because at that point the daughter was considered a kind of piece of property that the family, particularly the father or the father figure, could dispense of. And Mrs. Croft, who, of course, is married for love, not for status or not for childbearing, says, I would rather have young people settle on a small income at once and have to struggle with a few difficulties together than be involved in a long engagement, which is, of course, was the problem with Benwick and his fiancée, is that they were engaged until he could achieve enough money so that they could, or earn enough money so they could live a comfortable lifestyle. And one of the messages is that in the novel is that this isn't necessarily the best way to proceed. As Mrs. Croft says, it's better to have less money and to have love and connection and to struggle rather than to wait and wait and wait. And who knows what the consequences of that might be. Of course, there is a certain level of irony here because I've always maintained that if Wentworth had not returned with a sizable fortune, I don't know if Anne would have accepted him, even after she's learned that she should not have been so easily persuaded to go against her heart. And she says, if I was wrong in yielding to persuasion once, remember it was to persuasion exerted on the side of safety, not of risk. And I was right in submitting to her. And that if I had done otherwise, I would have suffered more in continuing the engagement than I did even in giving it up, because I should have suffered in my own conscience. So basically, what we've got here is an author who's willing to be progressive, but up to a point, as we see through Anne saying that she doesn't necessarily completely regret not listening to her heart and being influenced by outside sources. And of course, what Anne does say that is very progressive, though, and I wanted to draw your attention to this quote, men have every advantage of us, she's talking about women, in telling their own story. And I can't help but that's the author herself, Jane Austen, is basically talking about how she, as a female, has the opportunity to talk about the female perspective. However, gently she's going about doing that by providing us with a central female character. And that ultimately, all the privilege I claim for my own sex, Anne says, is that of loving the longest when existence or when hope is gone. The idea that she's carried a torch for Wentworth all of this time, because this is a romance. And we get our happy ending. Anne and Frederick Wentworth marry. He's going to assist Mrs. Smith. The plot twist is that Mr. Elliot ends up with, of all people, Mrs. Clay. We talked a little bit about her last class, that she's Elizabeth's friend, and even though she, like Mrs. Smith, is a widow and doesn't necessarily have much income, that's sort of ignored. And the concern is that perhaps she has designs on Sir Walter Elliot. And if that doesn't come to fruition, it turns out that Mrs. Clay and Mr. Elliot in our plot twist end up being a couple, which makes perfect sense because both of them are duplicitous characters. And the idea of clay is something that's easily moldable. Now, our next class is going to be devoted to Jane Eyre, but I wanted to talk a little bit about Jane Eyre, which is our longest text of the semester, which is the bad news. But the good news is that this text moves much more quickly than Persuasion does. Deliberately so, because we're going to get a different view on female. Instead of seeing a female from the privileged class, we are going to see a female from the poor, orphaned class, and find out that this person, Jane, if you've heard the expression of plain Jane, because it turns out that plain is also is in reference to Jane's appearance. She also is not attractive, which was considered to be important for female at the time and perhaps still is. That she has self-respect in a very modern way. And this really, what it is, it's a coming of age novel, but it's also a Gothic romance. So this brings us back to the idea of Frankenstein. And we had talked about some of the Gothic elements, about these large, decrepit buildings, mysteries that need to be solved, heroines in distress, and the possibility of supernatural events. We see also, in addition to some of the Gothic tropes in this piece, social and religious commentary, which makes this a very progressive book. The author of Jane Eyre initially, Charlotte Bronte, initially wrote under a pseudonym, Currer Bell. So the gender of the author was uncertain when the book first came out. And one of the reviewers, a female reviewer no less, from the Quarterly Review, her name is Elizabeth Rigby. And if you're using the text that I had ordered for us in class, the hard copy text, this information is included in the introduction. This reviewer had said that Jane Eyre's author is, quote, blamed for the highest moral offense a novel writer can commit, that of making an unworthy character, in other words, Jane Eyre, interesting. The book was said to be mischievous, vulgar, and pandering to the public taste for illegitimate romance. And remember how we established in the Cult of True Womanhood early on in the semester that a book could ruin a girl, and that was the idea that I had that you could perhaps pursue with a paper, but of course you can always create your own paper topic as long as you have that topic approved by me. Jane, unlike our previous female character, our protagonist, is an active participant. She's not an observer the way Anne Elliot is. And Erica Jong, who you might be familiar with because she is a very noted feminist, said that Jane Eyre might be the first heroine in fiction to know that she needs her own identity more than she needs marriage. Her determination not to relinquish selfhood for love could well belong to a contemporary heroine. Again, very modern idea. So, in the preface to the text, one of the things that Charlotte Bronte talks about, that conventionality is not morality. Self-righteousness is not religion. And Jane Eyre goes to show us that. I always think of Jane Eyre as 5 separate books. I think it's easier to address the length of the text in this way. And if you were to do so, and you can see this in the notes below under the 3rd section, that I've divided it up into 5 sections, or 5 books, if you will. The first being Gateshead. And the names, I can tell you right now, are going to be very important in this novel. Gateshead would be the first 4 chapters, and this is one stage of Jane's life. Lowood, another stage of Jane's life, chapters 5 through 10. A third stage of Jane's life is in Thornfield. That's perhaps the longest part, chapters 11 through 27. Moor House and Marsh End, yet another stage of Jane's life, chapters 28 and 35. And then the final stage of Jane's life, because Jane is an adult narrator reflecting back on her past, is Ferndean, chapters 26 to 38. So that's certainly how I'm going to be approaching it, as 5 separate books. Now, in terms of movie adaptations, one that I can recommend is through the BBC, which is a very esteemed British broadcasting outlet that oftentimes is known for its Shakespearean adaptations. So you might have heard of the BBC project to put all of Shakespeare's plays in their original form on film. They are the most accurate versions that you're going to get of Shakespeare's plays. This was done in the 1980s, and it's something that I talk about in my Shakespeare class. But the BBC in 2006 came out with a very good version of Jane Eyre. Now, Jane Eyre is a long book, and their adaptation is long. Movie versions of Jane Eyre tend to leave out quite a bit. They usually focus on the Thornfield section, which is where there is a romance, and they oftentimes neglect or condense the other sections. That said, even the BBC version has to condense. To give you an idea, if you were to see all of the versions in the BBC 2006 that I'm recommending, there are 4 episodes that are each about an hour long. So this is a 4-hour view. But I wanted to provide that to you in the event that you thought you might want to see this. Of course, watching an adaptation is never a substitute for reading. This would be just a supplement for reading. But if you found yourself having a difficult time with reading Persuasion, I think you will be very pleasantly surprised when you come to Jane Eyre. So for today's attendance question, which I'm hopeful can assist you with your first paper, especially if you're planning on writing about persuasion. This will be due on Thursday the 12th, though certainly if you need additional time, please let me know. As you know, you're not required to respond to your classmates, but you are required to read your classmates' responses and my responses in turn. To identify an interesting quote in Persuasion. I've identified a few of my own. So now it's your turn to identify an interesting quote in Persuasion and indicate why you find it to be interesting. And again, what would be ideal is that you would have your first paper in on that Thursday, which is the 12th, so that I can return that to you as soon as possible. But certainly, if you don't have it in by the 12th, let me know what's going on as we are talking about Jane Eyre, because the time will go very quickly after Jane Eyre, and before you know it, we will be at the ending of our semester. So I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class talking about Jane Eyre. Take care. Bye-bye.